Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 164, printed in Part A of House Report number 118-559, offered by Ms. Tenney of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1316, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Tenney, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Chair, I rise today to offer my amendment to prohibit any funding to finalize, implement, or enforce the Federal Acquisition Regulation, known as FAR, Council's proposed Federal Acquisition Regulation disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions and climate-related financial risk rule. Mr. Chair, this disastrous rule proposed by the FAR Council has numerous constitutional, national security, and practical concerns, none of which have been adequately addressed by the FAR Council, nor the Council on Environmental Quality, who have pushed for this rule. First and foremost, this rule requires all federal contractors that do more than $50 million worth of business with the federal government to disclose all Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. This rule also seeks to require major federal contractors to comply with the Paris Climate Accords, which has never been ratified by the Senate. But the most objectionable part of this rule is the requirement that companies set climate targets and then have them, and required to have them validated by one specifically named company called Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI. SBTI is a foreign entity based in London, which inherently carries national security concerns. Under this rule, every major federal contractor, including companies critical to our national security and our defense industrial base, would have to provide this foreign company with information about all of their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and then strategize on how to reduce them. Despite the existence of numerous American and U.S.-based companies that could fill the same role, the FAR Council and CEQ, Council on Environmental Quality, chose a foreign entity as the named sole source provider. Why? Because SBTI is nothing but a front for Democratic donors and advocacy groups. SBTI is owned by the We Mean Business Coalition, which is a project of the New Venture Fund, which is managed by none other than Arabella Advisors. Arabella Advisors, for those who do not know, is the George Soros-funded left-wing advocacy group that funnels dark money to left-wing causes and candidates. To summarize, the Biden administration has named a subsidiary of one of its top donors, a left-wing dark money organization, as the sole source provider for all climate target validating for all major federal contractors. During a hearing in the Science, Space, and Technology Committee on this rule, even the Democrats' witness said that SBTI was a poor choice for this role, yet the Biden administration forged ahead anyway. I look forward to continuing my work with Chairman Lucas, Chairman Olbernolte, and all my colleagues on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee to get to the bottom of this rule's creation and halt its implementation. Mr. Chair, I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment, and with that, I reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Hawaii seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I claim time in opposition.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I read this amendment carefully, and what I saw in this amendment and the policy choices that it engages have nothing to do with what I just heard from the proponent of this amendment. So let me deal with the merits of this amendment as it stands and as it relates specifically to the Department of Defense. And this amendment in that context is just another in a long line of initiatives by my colleagues to drive out of the Department of Defense any concern for, much less mention of, anything bearing the name of or in any way implicating the dreaded phrase climate change. Based on this amendment, this apparently includes any reference to consideration of greenhouse gas emissions or extreme weather risk in federal procurement. All this despite the fact that the DoD itself is eyes wide open on the realities of climate change, as we've seen repeatedly in this debate. So let's unpack the real amendment here and ask ourselves what it actually does. Well, very directly, first of all, this amendment would defund any requirement by DoD that greenhouse gas emissions or climate-related risk be disclosed by companies doing business with the Department of Defense. Now, it's nothing new to utilize federal procurement to address broader concerns, especially when the largest procurement office in the federal government is the Department of Defense. So the only real conclusion to be reached from the amendment is that greenhouse gas emissions and climate risks are not broader concerns, nor are they concerns, certainly, to the Department of Defense. In fact, for the Department of Defense and federal government contracting to look at this amendment, those can't be factored in at all. They can't even be known. So let's just take a couple of examples, and yes, let's assume everything else. So let's take out of this argument the false argument that somehow it is going to detract from quality, cost, quantity. Let's equalize that. That's all part of federal procurement anyway. And let's just look at the amendment itself and with DoD requirements in some real examples. So let's take an example. One contractor, proposed contractor, is utilizing the dirtiest, largest emitting, most unsustainable forms of energy for a product, while the other, quality, quantity, productivity, everything else equal, has invested in clean energy consistent with international emission targets, not to mention our own targets. Should we factor that in at all in federal procurement? Should we even know that? Should we effectively penalize the company that is doing the right thing and incentivize the company that is not? I think the answer is that we should know it, and we should factor it in. Let's take another example. One contractor has fully disclosed any risks of extreme weather conditions on its business model, its financial stability, its climate-related resilient preparedness, the continuity and predictability of operations on key supply chain components, while the other has ignored the obvious concerns that may lead to disruption of key components and higher costs, unexpected costs in the procurement cycle, fiscal insolvency. Should we factor that in? Should we even know it in federal procurement? I think the answer is yes. Clearly, in both instances, realistic and prudent defense procurement, not to mention compelling national policy, says yes. This amendment, at the end of the day, is grounded in the incorrect assumption that a strong defense industrial base is fundamentally incompatible with cleaner, sustainable energy and climate resiliency. That is not correct. We know that, and the Department of Defense knows that. And the Department of Defense, moreover, knows that if we don't address climate-related risk around the world in all parts of its operations, from operations to readiness to procurement, that it faces greater risks. Let's let the Department of Defense address these issues without weighing in with denial and diversion and fear-mongering. I urge that we oppose this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chair, with all due respect, the gentleman is wrong about this amendment. It simply states the amendment defunds and causes us not to fund the implementation of this particular rule, has nothing to do with climate change, has nothing to do with any of those allegations he's just set forth in his prepared notes. It's all bluster. This rule is about the fact that this is a sole source contract. SBTI was incorporated after the rule was actually made. They were trying to find a company that they could use that would get the answers they wanted. There's no choice for any American company. No U.S.-based company in this category has a choice. They must use this Arabella dark money super PAC money umbrella that is funded by left-wing George Soros and all these organizations in order to get their contracts approved. There isn't a choice. You can't go to anyone else. Even the Democrats in the Science, Space, and Technology Committee admitted there was no other choice. And here's a company created after the fact that they needed somebody to validate what they wanted, not to determine what the actual science was. This isn't a debate about climate change. It's a debate about science and making sure that our companies have their secrets secured, that they're with American-based companies that we can provide oversight for, that the Department of Defense can provide its oversight. It's not about some kind of climate issue. It really doesn't address that at all. It really addresses the national security concerns. It addresses the problem that we have a company that is foreign-owned, which is requiring American-based companies to disclose only to them with no choice, a sole source. This is not actually acceptable under DoD rules. And that's why we want this particular rule to be held up until we can get other options for our U.S.-based companies that ensure the security of the American people. This is a sad attempt at trying to politicize, again, the Department of Defense under the guise of some kind of climate rule. With that, I yield.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Hawaii is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, again, let's read the amendment. There's no mention in this amendment of this mysterious company. There is no commitment by the Department of Defense to use a specific company. This is a matter of disclosure. These companies have to disclose this information to the Department of Defense. This is also still a proposed rule, and certainly there is enough time in the process for us to carry out any concerns over, directed sole sourcing or national security, which I think is just a red herring. Of course, this is about climate change. Of course, this is about a continued effort to deny climate change. I urge opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from New York. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Hawaii.
Mr. Chair, I request a recorded vote.